Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the cinnamon ball python. The cinnamon's actually a dark gene, and when you work it into other combinations, usually you get a darkening effect as far as the background of the pattern of the snake. And kind of the weird thing about the cinnamon is it can be really variable. Sometimes cinnamons look like a really dark normal, and sometimes they can have like a reddish brown, almost a coppery color to the cinnamon. So depending on what version of cinnamon you start with, you can get some really different results as far as the visual appearance of some of your combinations. And kind of the cool thing about the cinnamon is you can make some really crazy combinations like you really can't make with any other gene. If you actually make the super cinnamon, you get an almost jet black, completely patternless snake, which is pretty awesome. You can also make a lot of silver colored snakes by adding pastel or super pastel to the mix, making like the sterlings or the silver bullets. And one of my favorites is the gray matter, working the super cinnamon into a champagne, and you get a pied looking snake that has almost like metallic looking color to it. Pretty awesome. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the cinnamon ball python. Alright, so I want to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with this snake right here. This is what one version of the cinnamon looks like. And it's kind of interesting how variable the cinnamon can be. And this one looks almost like a normal. As a matter of fact, I actually have a normal female that looks almost exactly like this. And when I first started looking at the darker cinnamons, I started thinking, hey, I wonder if my normal actually has some cinnamon in it versus it just being a normal. I'm pretty sure I've actually produced quite a few snakes from that normal, and I don't think there's any cinnamon at all in there, but sometimes it can kind of trick you just looking at one copy of the gene. As a matter of fact, this is actually really quite a bit darker than even my normal. If you actually look at the head on this one, how dark the head is, pretty amazing, and it's super like almost like an inkjet black background on this cinnamon. Pretty super dark. And I actually pulled up another cinnamon here. Take a look at this one. This is kind of the opposite spectrum of the cinnamon. This is like probably the brightest reddish colored cinnamon that I could find over here on Morphmarket. And I'd say usually when you're looking at a cinnamon, it's somewhere between this bright red color and the really dark color, pretty much all the different shades in between. And really when you're making combinations, you can definitely tell which version you're starting with depending on the final product, kind of the visual appearance of all the genes mixed in. So you can actually take two cinnamons, breed them together, and 25% of the time this is what you get. You get a super cinnamon. And take a look at this, completely jet black patternless snake, which is pretty awesome. If you actually look at this snake and how dark it is, you can definitely tell you started with the dark version of the cinnamon to actually get the snake. I actually pulled up another super cinnamon here. This is actually, take a look at this one. This is like from the reddish brown version of the cinnamon. You breed two of them together and you get kind of this reddish brown super cinnamon. It's pretty amazing, the variability from one to the other. And usually with a lot of the super cinnamons, and sometimes even with the cinnamons, you get these little tiny like paradoxing in the combinations, especially with the super cinnamon, almost like little random spots all over the snake. Sometimes they have a lot of spots and sometimes there's just a few, which is kind of an interesting anomaly. So I kind of wanted to show you what happens when you work the super cinnamon into the champagne. This is one of my favorite combinations. It's actually called the gray matter. And the champagne, I'd say it's kind of a challenge to work with the champagne. Usually when you mix other genes with champagne, you get kind of almost like a patternless snake in a lot of cases that's just a shade of a different color. Champagne can be pretty challenging to work with. And I'd say probably one of the best champagne combos that you can make is working super cinnamon into champagne. Take a look at this crazy snake. This actually looks like a pied with these big splotches of white in the snake. And kind of the interesting thing, it's not pied at all. It's not even het pied. It's just kind of the effect of working the super cinnamon into the champagne, giving you a weird kind of a pied looking effect when you mix it together, which is kind of weird. Usually the pied is a recessive gene and you need two copies of the pied for visual. And if you actually look at the colored spots on this is actually, you can definitely tell this was probably, I'd say this is probably the reddish brown version of the cinnamon to give you almost like a browned out metallic looking color. If you actually start with the black version of the cinnamon, you get almost like a metallic, almost looks like aluminum or steel or something like that. It looks like a bright, kind of a shiny metal color on the snake instead of this almost like a bronze color in this case. And kind of the interesting interesting thing about the champagne, kind of on a side note, if you're interested, you can actually take a champagne and breed it to a visual pied and get all champagne het pieds, and the champagne het pieds look like a visual pied. It's kind of an interesting effect with the champagne and just one copy of the recessive pied gene. As a matter of fact, if you actually make a champagne pied with 2 copies of the pied, it's an all-white snake with no color at all. Kind of a weird anomaly with the champagne, and somehow the champagne kind of interacts with certain genes to kind of give you this pied looking effect, which is kind of an interesting, kind of a weird part of the champagne gene. So here's the pastel. If you actually work pastel into the cinnamon, you get some really crazy effects. I say it's probably one of the most unique combinations, kind of unexpected when you work it together. The pastel, usually what happens when you work pastel and other genes, it usually brings out a lot of yellow because the pastel is yellow. And a lot of times the pastel will also reduce the pattern. And usually with pastels, you actually have green eyes. I don't know if you can actually see it in this one. Can't really see the green eyes in this one, but usually if you have pastel in the mix, or just like a super pastel, or just one copy of the pastel, usually it has green eyes, sometimes really bright green eyes. I actually have some lemon blasts, which are pastel pinstripes that have really bright green eyes. So here's what happens if you work pastel into the cinnamon. Take a look at this. So this is kind of an interesting combination here. This is actually a pewter, which is also kind of the abbreviation, kind of the slang, I guess you would call it, of the pastel with the cinnamon. And the pewters can be really variable. I'd say this is probably the brightest red pewter that I've ever seen over here at Morphmarket. And when I think of pewter, I think of the silver colored pewter. Take a look at this. This is also a pewter, which is pretty amazing. You can go from all the way from the reddish brown pewter to the silver colored pewter, which is kind of an interesting effect, working different versions of the cinnamon into some of your combinations. You can definitely tell this one probably originated from the dark version of the cinnamon. So take a look at this one. This is actually the sterling, and the sterling is the same thing as the pewter, except it has another copy of the pastel. So it is the cinnamon super pastel, and it makes, sometimes it can make kind of like a reddish brown snake, and a lot of times it'll make this really silvery colored snake. Kind of an interesting anomaly with the sterlings. I actually pulled up another one here. Take a look at this one. This is another silver colored snake. This is the super pewter. So this actually has 2 copies of the cinnamon and 2 copies of the pastel. And for some reason, when you work the cinnamon and the pastel together, you can have a whole rainbow of different versions of silver snakes in a lot of cases, which is pretty awesome. And I pulled up one more silver snake, and it's kind of hard to keep track of all these different silver snakes. This is actually the silver bullet, and the silver bullet actually contains the super cinnamon and 1 copy of the pastel. So you can actually have 1 or 2 copies of the cinnamon or the pastel in combination, and you can make some really crazy looking silver snakes, or work it in with champagne and still get, you know, a metallic looking pied snake. Pretty awesome effect working cinnamon into some of these combinations. So take a look at this. This is actually the black pastel. The black pastel happens to be allelic with cinnamon. So you actually take the black pastel, breed it to the cinnamon, 25% of the time you get a black pastel cinnamon, also known as an 8-ball. Take a look at this. And an 8-ball is a completely black patternless snake. And usually the 8-ball is a little bit blacker than the super cinnamon. It's kind of an interesting effect of the black pastel. And it's actually an allelic complex. So if you actually bred this to something else, half the offspring would come out as black pastel, half would come out as cinnamon. And really, I'd say in a lot of cases you really need a keen eye to tell the difference between the black pastel and the cinnamon. As a matter of fact, if we go back to the black pastel, usually it has a darker background, as far as kind of almost like an inkjet black background. And a lot of times the black pastel have more of a goldish color, although you can have different versions of the cinnamon. And I think a lot of times, sometimes it can be really difficult to pick out the black pastels and the cinnamon depending on what versions of the genes that you start with. I would think it'd be really easy to confuse the two. So here is the albino. It's kind of an interesting effect when you work albino into the super cinnamon, gives you an interesting effect. The albino is actually a recessive gene, so you need 2 copies of the albino gene to get a visual. And the albino is super visually dominant, pretty much trumps everything. Usually when you work other genes into albino, you get an albino looking snake that usually just has a jumbled up pattern. You can definitely tell it is still albino. And here's what happens if you take the super cinnamon, work it into albino. Take a look at this. You actually get what is known as a cue ball. I've actually heard people, you know, it's kind of the 8 ball versus the cue ball. You know, you have the completely black one and then you mix in albino and you get the completely white one. I suppose you could also call this like a cherry bomb. A lot of people say the white snake with the red eyes is a cherry bomb. There's quite a few ways you can make a cherry bomb. So this is kind of interesting because it's the super cinnamon on top of the albino. So if you bred this to something else, everything would come out as cinnamons with 1 copy of the albino. It would be het albino. So it's a little bit difficult to hit this because you need 2 copies of the cinnamon and 2 copies of the albino. So there's one more I wanted to show you. Take a look at this one. This is a really cool combination you can make with the cinnamon, and this is the Cinnamon Oreo Blizzard. I just love this name. I don't know, it just makes me hungry when I look at this, the Cinnamon Oreo Blizzard. And that is a really crazy snake. Look at all those speckling, and a lot of these have little paradoxings here and there on the Cinnamon Oreo Blizzards. If you actually take a look at the genes, this actually just has 1 copy of the cinnamon and the yellow belly, the pastel, and the calico. And it's kind of weird. I almost can't even wrap my head around the genetics as far as making this really crazy looking snake. So essentially what you have is you have the cinnamon and the pastel, which makes the pewter, and then you add the yellow belly to the pewter, and then the yellow belly usually brings out a lot more yellow and orange, and then you actually add calico, which usually brings up the white on the side. So I don't know how these genes are interacting to make the Cinnamon Oreo Blizzard, but that is one awesome looking snake. Alright, so it's time for the question of the day. And MMA Trend asks, what month do you start pairing up your ball pythons, putting the males with the females? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, I actually start pairing up my snakes on October 15th is kind of the date. I just have, you know, a set date every single year that I start pairing up the males and females. And essentially what I do is I have a whole list kind of in the off season where I'll have all the males and the females, and I'll start planning it pretty much all year long, which males I'm going to pair up with my females. And then a lot of times during the year I can actually change it so you know, a lot of times you'll come up right against the date and then you'll be like kind of scrambling trying to figure out what to pair up, and then sometimes you pair something up and you kind of have breeders where you're like, oh, I shouldn't have paired that up. So I always kind of take a few months to kind of figure out, and you know, at least a few months, maybe about 6 months, you know, kind of organize all my breeding pairs. And a lot of times I'll switch them around and kind of change my mind at the last minute on some of them. And then usually, as a matter of fact, it's actually about 2 months before October 15. And this is the time when you should really start, you know, increasing the feeding frequency on your females. At least feed once a week if you can, sometimes 2 times a week, depending on the sizes of the rodents that you can actually give the females. And then pretty much right before a breeding, what I do is actually go through and I kind of look at the body condition of all of my females, and if they're looking really good and they're eating pretty well, I'll go ahead and pair them up. And if they're not eating and looking a little bit skinny, I'll actually give them the year off, and hopefully the next year they'll actually gain a little bit more weight to where they get a better body condition going into the following breeding season. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.